You're listening to the dangerous mind of Mark Yoshimoto Nemcoff. No excuses, no BS, no pants.
So this is the Clarion in Fig-8. And I think this is a storytelling tone. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Microphone Playboy podcast. So not a whole lot has been written about what happened after Casey at the bat and the effects it had on Mudville. And it's a really fascinating story. Let me tell it to you. Casey? The reporter asked softly. The hospital room was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of antiseptic. The reporter lingered for a moment. As the man in the bed turned away, his weathered face to the wall, silent, before closing his eyes. The reporter's heart pounded because he was now certain a long-lost baseball legend had finally been found. In the annals of baseball lore, no story resonates quite like the tale of Casey at the bat. The mighty slugger, known across the land as the finest player of his era, was the pride of Mudville. His name was spoken with reverence, and his feats on the field were the stuff of legend. But on that fateful day when Casey struck out, the ramifications were far greater than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just a loss for Mudville. It was a loss that would spiral into economic disaster, social upheaval, and even a fiery inferno. Casey was a man, a myth, and a legend, all wrapped up in an enigma. A perennial all-star who ended up as one of the most tragic figures in sports. With a bat in his hands, Casey was unstoppable, the greatest player anyone had ever seen. His prowess on the field was legendary. Home runs that seemed to defy gravity, catches that belonged in the realm of the impossible, and a batting average that left pitchers shaking in their cleats. But it wasn't just his athletic prowess that made him a legend in Mudville. Casey worked by day at the old Mudville match factory, like many others in town. And it was said that for all of his fame on the diamond, he never put on airs, never considered himself above the common folk. His broad shoulders carried bundles of uncut match lumber as easy as they hefted a bat, and his hands were rough from long hours on the factory floor. The workers loved him. It wasn't every day a town star athlete punched the same clock, stood shoulder to shoulder in the break room, and knocked back a beer after hours with the guys. Mudville wasn't just a town. It was a community. Its people lived and breathed by the match factory, which provided most of the jobs, and by the local baseball team, which gave them pride. Weekends were for baseball, and no game was bigger than when Casey stepped up to the plate. When the factory whistle blew, the workers flocked to the ballpark, eager to watch their hero in action. But the day Casey struck out, everything changed. Mudville was on the brink of victory, the tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. With 2 men on base and 2 outs, Casey strode to the plate, brimming with confidence. The crowd was electric, certain their hero would deliver. But then in a twist no one saw coming, Casey swung and missed. The crowd's roar of anticipation turned to a collective gasp of horror as the umpire called the final strike. Casey had lost. Mudville had lost. And it was only going to get worse from there. The strikeout wasn't just a defeat on the field. It was a blow to the heart of the town. Truth was Mudville's economy had been teetering for years, and Casey's failure was the final nail in the coffin. The match factory, the town's largest employer, began to struggle soon after. Some said it was a coincidence, but others believed it was a curse. Casey's strikeout had doomed them all. The whispers in town were hard to ignore. Mudville was cursed the day Casey missed. In the shadow of Casey's curse, and without the pride and morale that baseball had provided, the town began to unravel. Because its customers associated the match factory with Casey's failure, orders plummeted. Layoffs began, and the workers who had once cheered Casey from the bleachers now muttered bitterly in the taverns. Then one fateful February night, a fire broke out at the mill. The flames spread quickly, fueled by stacks of dry matchwood, and by morning, the mill had been reduced to ashes. Initially, the fire had been deemed an accident, but rumors began to circulate that the fire had been started intentionally, and after initially saying they would rebuild the factory in the spot where it once stood, the owners of Mudville Matches decided instead to outsource production overseas. The storied Mudville Match Factory gate was padlocked and the site abandoned. With it went the jobs, the hope, and the future of Mudville. Casey's curse was real, people said. Businesses shuttered one by one, and families packed up, leaving their homes behind in search of new opportunities elsewhere. The once bustling ballpark stood empty, overtaken by weeds, its silence a stark reminder of a town that had once lived and breathed baseball. After the fire, hounded by critics and the weight of his own guilt, Casey couldn't bear to stay in Mudville. The shame, the whispers, the pointed looks, they were too much for him. Some even blamed Casey for the fire. One night, without a word to anyone, he simply vanished. He left behind an empty room at the boarding house, an unpaid rent bill, and a town that no longer had its hero. For years, Mudville was left wondering what had happened to their once beloved slugger. Some claimed they saw him in distant towns, working odd jobs, but nothing was ever confirmed. The town that once loved him had become nearly deserted, falling into ruin, and Casey seemed to have disappeared into the ether, never to be heard from again. Until one strange day. Thousands of miles away in a dusty village in rural Mexico, a man calling himself Muncie Green played baseball in the local league. He was older now, heavier, with a beard that disguised his face, and almost no hair left on his head. He was a decent player, but nothing like the man who had once dazzled crowds in Mudville. The locals found him odd. He had a peculiar habit of drinking turpentine, a strange addiction that left many of them puzzled. But no one knew who he really was, and he did nothing to change that. One night after a particularly rough game, Muncie was found doubled over in pain in his boarding house. His appendix had burst, and he was rushed to the nearest hospital. It was there, in that dimly lit room, that the reporter found him. When the reporter returned the next day, Casey, or Muncie Green, was gone. The bed was empty, the room silent. He had vanished once again, leaving behind nothing but a mystery. The reporter searched the nearby streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of the fallen hero. But Casey had disappeared into the night, just as he had all those years ago in Mudville. Mudville never recovered from Casey's strikeout. The town, once vibrant and full of life, became little more than a memory. The empty storefronts and crumbling buildings stood as a testament to the town's former glory, now long faded. The ballpark, now nothing more than a field of weeds, was the last remaining symbol of what Mudville had once been. And then, 2 decades after declaring bankruptcy, the entire town of Mudville was sold to a retail corporation as the location of a new shopping mall. But the legend of Casey lived on, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale. Coaches would tell their players about the mighty Casey, reminding them that no one is invincible and that the game is about more than just one player. And somewhere in a distant place, the man who had once been Casey still wandered, a shadow of his former self. Though the world had moved on, the memory of that fateful day in Mudville would forever be etched in the annals of baseball history, a reminder of the highs and lows that come with being a hero. And that's where the story would end, if it weren't for one unreported encounter that only come to light after the very same reporter who had tracked Casey down in Mexico had come across a curious 2-year-old social media post. Garrett Beavers had been a 6-year-old Casey fan in the Mudville stands on that fateful strikeout day, watching the famed disaster from the third base bleachers alongside his father and several of his father's co-workers at the match factory. Several decades later, Garrett, since retired from his accounting practice, had taken up a part-time job as a mall janitor. As he emptied a trash can, the man who entered by a side door near the pizza place caught Garrett's attention immediately. He was a stranger, but yet there was something very familiar about him. His gait, his large frame. The curious stranger seemed a bit out of sorts, possibly hungover, which wasn't a common state for customers at this time of morning. The stranger stopped Garrett to ask where the bathroom was, and it was only after he had taken off his sunglasses to expose bloodshot eyes that Garrett thought he knew this man. Perhaps it was something in Garrett's facial expression that spooked the stranger, but before Garrett could answer, the stranger said, "I'm really sorry," in a dull monotone, turning his head to the side. It was perhaps the defeated posture as the stranger walked away that sparked recognition in Garrett's mind. He wanted to follow the man, but as a woman asked where the pet supply store was, Garrett lost sight of him. Perhaps a half hour later, still watching for the stranger to appear again, Garrett saw a police car and an ambulance pull up to the front of the mall, and inside he had a very bad feeling. Following them to the storeroom in the back of a Sears, Garrett saw the man again. There in an aisle between two 15-foot-tall shelving units lay the stranger, dead. He just walked in past everyone, found a case of turpentine, and managed to down 2.5 cans before his heart stopped. The stranger had no wallet, no identification. However, inside the tag on the collar of the stranger's jacket had been scribbled the name, M. Green. But it was what they found inside the breast pocket of that jacket that caused Garrett Beaver's jaw to drop. Inside was a single box of Mudville Match Factory matches. Garrett recognized them right away. These were from a limited run created decades earlier, celebrating a Mudville 9 championship dating back 2 years before the famous strikeout changed everything. On the cover was an illustration of the mighty Casey in his prime, taking one of his legendary moonshot swings at the plate. Garrett shook the small box to hear the familiar sound of matches inside. It seemed as full as if they had just come off the factory line. But when he opened up the box and counted them, what he found were only 19 matches instead of the usual 20. One match was missing. During the autopsy, dental records would finally identify the stranger. The mighty Casey had come home. Questions? Comments? Let me know. Until next time, this is Mark Yoshimoto Nemcoff on the Lauten Clarion in Fig-8, fading to black.